Good morning. How's everybody? You have enough coffee? Hopefully you didn't stay up too late last night. I didn't. I was here the whole night just preparing my slides. Good morning, and welcome to Transforming Legacy to Modern. I'll spend the next 45 minutes with you talking about the adventures, the war stories, the survival stories on all things in Azure that I've had a chance to work in the past 10 years. Azure is 10 years old since last October, so there has been a lot of things that mostly worked spectacularly, or some things that didn't quite work out as I hoped they would be. Those would probably be during the early previews. My name is Jussi Roine, and as you can probably guess, I'm based in Helsinki, Finland. I'm one of those Finns that when I travel and I meet new people, I say the thing that all Finns like to say: please, could you stand a bit further away because I need my personal space. I've been working with Microsoft technologies for about 25 years now, and out of that I've spent 10 years with Azure, and it's been quite a lot of fun. I'll show you some cool stuff. I'll have some great stories to share with you as well. If you have any questions, let's have those at the end. Later on, if you want to send me good jokes or ask more questions, please use Twitter. My private messages are open in Twitter. It's an experiment I'm doing. It's not going well because I get a lot of direct messages from people from Asia offering me different kind of services they would like to sell to me. So I spend most of my days replying to those as well. I started in 1982 with a VIC-20. Anybody here who had a VIC-20? Oh, I see about 20 people. Excellent, you're my best friends now. And even though it was a VIC-20, it didn't have 20 kilobytes of memory. It had about 5 kilobytes of memory, and you only got 3.5 kilobytes. But at the time, that was more than enough to do this fancy basic style coding. So 2019, I log into Azure yesterday. I need to spin up a virtual machine. And what I can do is I can go with M128M. It gives me 128 virtual CPU cores. It gives me about 4 terabytes of RAM for an hourly price. So I can spin it up for an hour, do my fancy stuff, open Facebook practically, and then I can shut it down, and it's there. And I still have people complaining that I spin it up, it takes 4.5 minutes to spin up. I don't have all day. It needs to be pronto. It needs to happen now. So 30 years ago, VIC-20, we would load a game. It would take maybe 20 minutes. You would maybe have the cassette player, and if you pressed it just the right way, it would have turbo boost. But now we spin up amazing machines in 4.5 minutes, and it's too slow. So we're a bit spoiled in there as well. I don't think it's a bad thing, but it's just something we need to introduce a bit of realism as well. So what have I been up to lately? What keeps me up at night, besides the challenges that I get to work with my customers? One of the things I've been working, especially last night, is the smart ring that I purchased. It's the one I have here. It's fairly small. It's a great device. It gives me wellness data. It gives me readiness data. It gives me sleep data as well. And they give me an API. Sadly, it's not on Azure, but it's a standard-based API. So what I did, I built a custom Power BI connector to connect with the data that I get from the API. So every morning when I wake up and I have my family with me, we have morning porridge. I open the dashboard and we have a look at my sleep statistics, and we talk with the kids. Yeah, you should sleep. You should snore a little bit less so I can sleep a bit better. They don't often laugh at that. They just look at me angrily. I also built a PowerShell adapter just to test things out. So how this works out is I'm running it locally, and what I can do is I can run my PowerShell script. Activity type would be readiness. The start date would be yesterday because it's based on the night you actually go to sleep. And what I then need to do, I need to select a property which would be readiness, and from there I would select the score. So this gives me, through the API, this gives me the score for last night. It was 73. 100 is the max, 85 is fairly good, 73 is, yeah, you should probably use Azure a little bit less because you're not sleeping well enough or you're not resting well enough. So the next thing I'm doing, I'm connecting this with Azure Data Lake because I'm expecting a massive amount of data this weekend when I'm sleeping a bit more. And then finally, I'm using Azure Data Explorer to actually dive deep into the data that I'm getting. And once the data is in the data lake, I know it will have enough storage to store all of my data from this one ring. It gives me a JSON file. It's about 200 lines every night, but it's useful data. So this is something that I do on my free time, and on my daytime I spend with my customers. Let's have a quick glance in the past. 1990, Windows 3.11, that was great. You would have TCP/IP, you would have WinSock Trumpet, you would have the Windows clock, Solitaire, and yeah, that's about it. It still runs if you use an emulator, and you would have to use something called the quarter-deck memory manager, QM, to optimize your config.sys and autoexec.bat. I love those. I still miss the times when life was simple. I would simply open these two files, I would fiddle with the settings, my machine would be faster, or it would crash and it wouldn't boot anymore, or my sound blaster wouldn't give me any sound anymore. Today, I talk with developers. They go all crazy with NuGet packages and scaffolding and Yeoman generators, and I'm like, yeah, man, but I just want a config sys and an autoexec.bat that I can actually fiddle with. I don't want this automatically generated 200,000 line JSON files that I have no idea what happens in them. So 2000, we got Windows 2000 Advanced Server. It was a bit more expensive. I actually spent 1 weekend last year setting up a virtual machine running Windows 2000 Advanced Server because I wanted to use that to connect that with Azure. I had an Azure function that ran some of my business logic. And I wanted to have this legacy virtual machine that would connect to Azure and actually execute something for me. It would be this crazy hybrid modern Frankenstein's monster architecture that I would use as a showcase. I actually got it to run up until the point it would try to connect with Azure. Just in case, this is the pro tip here. If you ever need to spin up a Windows 2000 server, it doesn't support SSL3. So you cannot open any websites that require HTTPS. So that's a bit of a downer. But if you're fine with unencrypted traffic, go ahead, use Windows 2000. It's great. I also got my first Nokia phone with a camera in 2000. That was a Nokia 7650. And the resolution was less than 1 megapixel, but it was amazing. I think the resolution in my phone is something like 22 megapixels now. I take a picture of my lunch to show to my family, this is what I had today. They don't appreciate that either, but we have a family WhatsApp, so I keep spamming them. And I see, yeah, it's a bit blurry. I miss my old phone. It didn't have the blurry pictures. And last but not least, we would get these MSD and CD booklets full of CDs by mail, and you would get the latest bits. You only had to wait like 6 months to get the latest service pack, and it was amazing. Now, when I wake up in the morning, I might have a message from a customer telling me that, Jussi, we saw last night at 2:30 that Microsoft released this amazing new preview feature in Azure. What's the best practice in running that? And I go, well, I don't know, I was sleeping, but let me have a look what they released. Back in the day, we would wait 6 months and we would be happy. Some of the skills we required from developers in 2000, the ability to install whatever Visual InterDev or Visual SourceSafe or Visual Studio at the time. It was a setup, next, one reboot, you're good. Then you would have to have the ability to write HTML, maybe a little bit of Visual Basic. It was a bit hardcore at the time. We didn't have .NET yet, and we didn't really care about JavaScript, and we hated Java at the time. We still do, but we hated then at the same time. And if you knew how to press F5, you were kind of a hardcore developer. Your code would run, and that was amazing. So 2010, we had the amazing Lumia phones, the Nokia 800, or is it too soon to talk about it? No, I liked it. And then we had Office Clippy finally being retired. If you still miss Clippy, do a search for clippy.js. You get the JavaScript implementation that you can embed in your websites. It's really nice. And then we had the Metro UI, or the modern UI in Windows 8, 8.1, and Windows 10 as well. Now we're slowly getting that back with the Azure portal as well. So a lot has happened in the past 30 years. IT pros, they got virtualization. In early 2000, they would have virtual PC in 2007, and they would run their favorite operating system, probably Windows Vista at the time. Maybe there was a Windows XP that some people still like running. And this has been, for the past 15 years, this has really been the building block for IT pros. I'll put a virtual machine in there, it runs, it's whatever I needed to do, I'm good. I don't have to worry about anything else. Now we're talking about DevOps, and IT pros think, well, what's the ops portion here? The developers might say, yeah, we'll take care of the ops portion for you. We'll just deploy, you don't have to worry about it. And the IT pros might think, well, what's my role in the future? And then they go home and they hug their servers and feel comfortable again. So I have a couple of WTF adventures. WTF means welcome to Finland, if you didn't know. One was migrating an existing public-facing website to Azure. It was a bunch of VMs, about 5 VMs running Linux, different distributions. The schedule was 1 month. We had a 1-month budget from the customer. And the demand was to pick up these 5 VMs, deploy them to Azure, but you need to be on platform as a service, no VMs. It shouldn't be that hard. You're the pro. You've been working on this for 8 or 9 or 10 years already. So we started working on that. Then we figured, OK, so Drupal, not kind of natively supported. You can kind of run it. And we spent about 2 weeks trying to fix the problems we had, all the PHP horrors that you get. And on the way, the customer would say, well, actually, you need to do a facelift as well for the solution. We hope it's not a challenge because you're so good, you know how this is run. Long story short, after 4 weeks, we said on the second last day, yeah, this is not going to run. It's too legacy that we can just pick it up and deploy to Azure like a lift and shift, but lose the VMs. And it didn't even work in a container because of the old Linux distributions. So what we did, we spun up 5 VMs, copy-pasted them to Azure, and it's running quite nicely. And then we'll do a new project at some point. So it's acceptable to bring the old stuff for certain scenarios to the cloud as well. So 1 container might not be enough. We had a developer who deployed 5 containers, and they would run different containers. That wasn't good. So some of the core skills in 2019, when I mentor new people who start working in IT, they ask me about what's Azure, what's Office 365. I say, well, let me show you the core skills. You really need to know these. So they lean back on their IKEA chair. They get this lukewarm coffee from a plastic cup, and they say, OK, shoot, let's go. Let me learn all the cool stuff. And I start with, yeah, Windows R. This is the most important thing you need to learn. And I trust everybody's running a Windows. And then you have these fancy commands like ncpa.cpl, which opens network connections, control panel applets, so that you can fiddle with your TCP IP settings. And then you also need to know Windows E for opening File Explorer, and you need to know Alt-Tab to switch between windows. There's a surprisingly huge amount of people who do not know this. And last but not least, Windows X to get to the guard menus and all the fancy stuff. You can take a picture now if you don't know this. If you all know this, that's fine. I'm happy for you. But it's amazing that really core skills, so many people don't know this. They hop directly to Azure. They want to get the fancy stuff, but they lack the basics. So 2020, Azure today, 10 years old. There's a lot of cool stuff happening in there. We get these weekly announcements that there's 5 new services here. Last night, they announced Azure Sentinel, which is your security logging and managing service in the cloud with machine learning-based algorithms. They would say AI, but we know it's machine learning. Azure, back in the day, was something like this. You would run it on your own workstation or a laptop. It was a setup next, 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 finish, reboot, I'm good. It would run a development fabric for you. It would run a cloud service. You would have a web role and a worker role. You would deploy your code. If you needed to scale something, you would open the XML file with Notepad and replace number of hosts from 1 to 5. It would run 5 roles for you if you had enough memory in your laptop. It was so easy. It was 2 services in 2008, and it would simply run. But if somebody asked you, how do I deploy this to production? Well, we don't talk about that. That's for the developers. This is the ops side. Next, we got the Windows Azure platform, the Silverlight-based management portal. I think there's some websites still using Silverlight. I don't know why, but they probably love it so much. And this was kind of okay, even though the name at the time was Windows Azure. And finally, they lost the Windows bit in there because you can run Linux in Azure as well. And that's a huge portion of what happens in Azure nowadays. I kind of like this as well if you had Silverlight and if it actually worked at the time. Then we got the management portal. And this was probably the easiest approach to IT pros because we didn't have to worry about PowerShell or Azure CLI or any of the fancy hipster modern stuff. We would simply have a website, we would log in, we would do stuff. Unless you needed to modify the subscriptions, you would have a separate portal that we still have today, which is super slow, and you cannot find the link anywhere. But if you need to change the credit cards, that's where you need to go as well. And finally, we have something like this, automatically generated dashboards that bring you real-time data, real-time alerts, and you need a huge display to have everything readily available. Oftentimes, I tell people that you need to buy an external mouse for your laptop that has a side-scrolling wheel so that you can scroll quickly back and forth because you have so much data happening in there. And this is kind of the situation where we are at today. So according to Eurostat, the EU body that does statistics, they released in December the statistics for public cloud consumption within the EU nations. Finland, number 1. About 66% of Finnish enterprise companies are using a public cloud service or services. It doesn't necessarily mean it's Azure, even though I hope it would be. It might be something else. But this is not the private clouds. This is not the hosting companies. This is just public cloud. I'm personally super happy that we once again beat the Swedish. I'm also super happy that we beat the Dutch. I like the Dutch people, but yeah, we need to beat them as well. If you're looking for business opportunities, I would suggest Romania and Bulgaria. They're not really using public cloud. There's probably a lot of stuff you can do in there. So when I retire, and according to the Finnish taxation office, I get to retire at the ripe age of 69 years old and 11 months and 10 days. So that's only about 30 more years. When I eventually retire, I will apply to work at Eurostat. Because if you look at the lower right corner, data extracted December 2018, but the planned update is 2021. So they have 3 years of nothing, and then they work a couple of weeks to update this graphic, and they're good to go. Then they can wait three more years again. So Azure today, there's a lot of data centers. Typically, we are using West Europe in the Netherlands, or we are using North Europe near Dublin, even though that's not North Europe, that's like Western Europe for us. And we are getting something in Norway. We already have a lot of stuff in Germany. And finally, the South Africans are also getting the Azure data centers. They're not live yet, but hopefully any day now. The United Arab Emirates are also getting some, and the Swiss are getting their own Azure deployment. So there's a lot of good opportunities. There's a lot of excitement around Azure. Last year, in May, at the Microsoft Build conference, Mr. Nadella had this to say, that they're really focused on 2 platforms. One is Azure, the other is Office 365. Azure first, 365 then. So the opportunity really is to understand what's in Azure, about 165 services, plus the one they announced last night, so about 166 services today. So the opportunity in there for IT pros, developers, customers, partner companies, even end users, is to understand enough and be really, really good at a couple of select services you have in Azure. If you want to have a look at all the services, you of course go to azure.microsoft.com, select services, and you get this huge list. I tried to keep the list in one slide, so I zoomed out in my browser to something like minus 5,000%, and it still couldn't fit in one slide. There's so many services. So what I typically do, I just look it up from here. If somebody says, hey, Jussi, what do you think about XYZ? And I'm like, I've never heard about it. Yeah, it's in Azure. It was announced 27 seconds ago. You have to know everything about it. Well, I have to look it up first. Azure moves now at light speed. In July 2018, I was traveling with my family, also taking pictures of my lunch at the same time. Microsoft released Azure Firewall Preview end of July. And early September at the Microsoft Ignite conference, it was already out of preview. It was generally available. So about 2 months from public preview to GA. It's a little bit too fast. Too much stuff is happening. So it's really hard to keep track on what's in preview, what's under NDA, what's a private preview, what do we have in TAP, what's generally available, what's the SLA. That's why you often need to go to docs.microsoft.com and use the different communities that I'll show in a bit. Some of the changes they announced in July, August, and September. I hope you can read all this because we have a pop quiz at the end of the presentation to ask you about the dates. So another WTF. Create a website that scales indefinitely. Customer called me and said, we need to build a website from scratch. It needs to be on Azure PaaS. It needs to scale indefinitely. It needs to be 100% available. The SLA needs to be no SLA because it never crashes. It always runs. So I once again lean back on my IKEA chair and say, yeah, no problem. How much time do we have? 3 months. And it needs to happen in 3 months. So we started building that. And we didn't really aim for the 5 nines in the SLA, although I would playfully ask the customer, could we go with 5 nines, but it would be 89.99999. They didn't laugh at the joke. So the customer said pages must load in less than 1 second at all times, regardless on what's happening with the pages, and there's a huge database. Do what you must to make it so, and that's always great to hear because it means there's endless money happening. I can do whatever I need to do. So yeah, this is what we got on the release date. The cloud was full. I was scaling the web app instances from 5 to 10. So each instance was 7 gigs of RAM, 4 cores. And I was scaling from 5 to 10, so about 40 cores, 70 gigs of RAM to run a simple website in the cloud. We wanted to be sure that it scales. So this is the error I got. 0 instances are available. Please get available machines and retry later. I figured I probably need to go to a nearby store, buy some hardware, ship it to Dublin, and ask them to install them for me, because apparently you don't have enough of those. So I went to the product group, said, we've got a bit of a panic here. We need to scale. We cannot scale. Is the cloud full now? I got a call 10 minutes later. No, Jussi, the cloud is not full. Let me fix this for you. 5 minutes later, it was fixed. There was a bug that it didn't scale correctly. We were using Linux in the backend, so I like to blame Linux. If we were using Windows, no scaling issues. This is kind of the architecture we ended up with. It's super simple, but I wanted to show this to you so that you understand that you can build indefinitely scaling services in the cloud with fairly simple architectures. We have a web app that runs in Windows. The backend is a Node.js API that runs on Linux. And then we have a MongoDB that has all the data. We have a staging database. And we have a super fancy integration that's based on the classic CSV FTP upload method. It always works. Everybody knows how to build that, and there's no problems with the integration. So this has been running for about 2 years now. We've had 0 crashes because we use deployment slots. We also have separate staging, separate Q&A, separate testing, and separate dev environments. The total cost for running all of these environments is less than €1,000 per month with the normal regular discounts you get as an enterprise customer. So when we start transforming from legacy to modern, The IT pros, I love the picture, that's why I have it again here. IT pros for the past 25 years. You need to know how to install Windows, whatever version. You need to know how to do IaaS. You need to install SQL Server. If you don't know how, just download the white paper and follow the steps in there. You need to know how to install Service Pack and hotfixes 1 through 10,000. You need to do all the cumulative updates in the correct order. And then you need to reboot the server 27 times. When you're done with this, you're kind of done with your responsibilities. It's up to the business to figure what happens next. You can take your hands off. The ops portion is done now. And this I often find is the thinking still in 2019, that I deploy, but once it's deployed, it's somebody else's responsibility. We go to Azure, there's no deployment. Of course, there's some templates and CI/CD continuous pipelines, but that's often the developer who does that. The IT guy needs to do something else, and it's not this anymore. The required skills, and these are picked from a couple of different open positions with a couple of Finnish companies. Well, you kind of need to know Azure, IaaS, PaaS, everything in there. You need to do ARM templates by heart, and we heard about Terraform, so you need to know everything in Terraform as well, of course. You need to know everything in PowerShell, all the BAS, Azure CLI scripts, everything in Windows Server, ADs, SMB, TCP/IP, NetBIOS, Wins, DNS, DHCP, all the usual stuff, of course you know, and everything in Office 365. How hard can it be? You've got all the documentation. Just get cracking and get the stuff done. And you cannot really find a person who can do all of this. So that's why it's important to focus in having a couple of areas you're really good at, but have enough breadth that you can actually tackle the other challenges that you finally get. And if all else fails, it's always DNS. There's always a problem in DNS. Learn DNS and TCP/IP. You're more than good to go. A few thoughts about virtual machines. I don't hate them. I just passionately dislike them. The problem with VMs often is there's too many cooks hassling through RDP and SSH, doing stuff in the VMs. And if some poor summer temp employee goes and reboots one of those VMs, all hell breaks loose. Nobody knows what happens when the pending file operations kick in and something happens in the VM. Then you start restoring and doing backups and all of that stuff. So there's still a place for VMs, like in one of my examples, but VMs are not really the primary deployment target for anything anymore. If you have a justifiable reason, go for VMs. At all other times, do something else. So customers tend to expect a lot. The first cloud adoption wave started in Finland in 2011 or 2012. So those customers would be the forerunners, the early adopters. They would ask things like, yeah, we want to run stuff in the cloud. Can you deploy a couple of VMs, maybe even a SQL Server in there? Yeah, sure, we can do that. We kind of know how that works out. But now, since 2016, 2017, we started getting customers who are the second wave of cloud adoption. And those customers have been on the sidelines for 8 years. They have this huge list of requirements, and they will tell you that, okay, so we've been looking on the sidelines. We want all of this to happen. And you're the pro, so we expect all of this to be fixed and done in 2 days, because you're the pro. You know how this stuff works out. So it's really like a now or never. If you remember, in 1997, we had the movie Speed with Sandra Bullock and Keanu Reeves. They had the bus that went over the missing piece of the highway. It kind of feels the same. Just push the pedal to the metal and don't look back, and let's hope everything goes well. And then we have the customers who say, you go first. We don't really trust the cloud thingy. It's probably a fad that goes over in a couple of years. We want to be in on-prem because that's where the future is. Might be. There's still a place and position and a demand for on-prem, but it might be the opposite from the public cloud. The on-prem used to be the mainland. The cloud used to be the deserted island with one developer screaming that there's no servers. Now it's the opposite. Now the mainland is the public cloud and the lonely island with the IT pro or the developer screaming, there are servers. That's the difference now. And last but not least, we have the customers who realize we're on a journey. We move back and forth. It's not black and white. We might put some stuff in the cloud, but next year it might move back to on-prem for certain reasons, or everything to the cloud and back, or something in between. So another WTF, welcome to Finland moment. Hybrid cloud implementation, Azure on-prem, a couple of different data centers in on-prem, using ExpressRoute. And this was last year, so a customer of mine asked, Jussi, we want to use ExpressRoute to have SLA and enough bandwidth. What's the capacity for ExpressRoute? So by default, ExpressRoute-based peering and routing is 1 gigabit. And they said, well, it's too slow. Can you go any faster? Sure, it's 10 gigs as well as supported. No, not good enough. Don't they have 100 gigabit links? Not yet, it's in private preview. So I got them in the private preview. They were super happy with the 100 gigabit connection. And we started building this, and one of the architects in the project said, okay, so we need 100 Azure subscriptions for our implementation to work. I went back to them, why do you need 100 Azure subscriptions? They're essentially free to set up, but there's a lot of overhead, a lot of management involved. Yeah, well, we felt all of the different IT guys, they need their own. Why? Why can't you just have one resource groups, role-based access control? It's fairly good. No, we like it like this because everybody has their own ADs as well. Everybody has their own DNSs, DHCPs. Okay, why do you need ExpressRoute? Well, we figured it's fast enough for them. Alrighty then. But we eventually got it built with 2 Azure subscriptions. Quick side story, Spiceworks, a company named Spiceworks, did a survey last year on different companies. How do you plan on using collaborative chat applications? And they would ask, are you planning on using Sky for Business, Teams, Slack and whatnot? And if you look closely, there's a combination of 9% of companies in Europe that have a plan to deploy Sky for Business in the next 1 to 2 years. They probably didn't get the memo that Sky for Business is really no more in the cloud. It's Teams now. But it's good to take your time to wait 10 years for the technology to be mature enough and then finally make the leap when the service is about to be phased out. So we still have people really preaching about serverless, and we have IT pros often saying, yeah, but there's a server somewhere. I know there is. Of course there is. There's an operating system, there's hardware, but it's not for you to manage, it's for you to actually run. Let me show you a super quick demo, and running live demos is always exciting to me when you never know how the network is running. So I've got a simple static website using HTML5, of course, and a lot of JavaScript, or one-liner. And it's an aka.ms tracker. So Microsoft people have this internal aka.ms link shortener service that we cannot access as normal people. And they often tweet out stuff like, yeah, aka.ms/conditional property, check it out, and it resolves to a real address. So I started tracking those on Twitter last year. I've got about 200,000 aka.ms addresses. And I store them in Azure SQL, and I render out this nice page. So when I do my own presentation content, I can pick up the fancy aka.ms addresses, and people think I'm a bit more modern and hipster than I really am. The only downside, of course, is that Microsoft can change where the link is being redirected, so I can never trust it actually works out. So how I built this, I used logic apps to trigger when somebody tweets about aka.ms. I pick up the tweet, I verify there's a real link in there, but then I need to use Azure Functions to pick up the link, make a quick HTTP GET, so that from the headers, I can get the 301, the dynamic or permanent redirect, and store that so that I get the title and the real address of that. So I'm using 3 different Azure functions for that. I dump everything in an Azure SQL, and then I dump a text file out of that that looks like a nice HTML, and I use JavaScript to render it out. You can access the site with what was the address? akmslookup.azurewebsites.net if you want to try this out. So I'm using that simply to see what kind of services I can build with Azure Functions. And the Azure Functions took me about an hour to build. They're built with C#. The more modern people would probably use something like Python, but C# is the thing I know best. So it's funny to run that. It costs me about €4.50 a month to run this. So the Azure database is €4.20, and the Azure functions are 30 cents on top of that. So I still end up in discussions with customers who say, yeah, the virtual machines are €2,000 a month. How much is Azure functions? We spend 40 minutes calculating, and then we get to the conclusion, yeah, it's about €1 a year. Yeah, we can probably afford that. We just spent an hour, 5 people on this to calculate the amount. So another WTF, upgrading IaaS to PaaS. From MongoDB to Cosmos DB. Cosmos DB was announced about 2 years ago. Customer heard about it and said, we want Cosmos, it sounds cool, it has to be better than MongoDB because it's not Cosmos. And we figured, well, Cosmos DB has a Mongo API, so it probably works quite like that. So we figured we can just do scalability load testing, migrate the database, call it a day, and charge amazing amount of money for something super simple. We spent 3 months fixing the problems for the front end, for the back end, just by connecting to Cosmos DB, because it was still in preview. For one, they would lack the aggregate functions. You couldn't do a query against Cosmos DB using Mongo API to say, give me all entries that are from 2017 or earlier. It didn't have the less than or equal functions. I would once again call people in Redmond, ask in my nice Finnish polite way, what the hell are you guys thinking? Can't you fix this? They came back to me and said, well, yeah, but you're really the first one to ask about it. So we'll get coding, we'll get back to you. 3 weeks later, we had that, and it kind of worked. It was a bit painful, but it was a good lesson in understanding that not everything works super simple, even if it's available in the preview. So what if we let go of on-premises? This is something I get almost on a weekly basis from customers. Sure, we can use Azure AD for identity management, but how do you do your printers? How do you do your Wi-Fi access points? How do you distribute your IP addresses if you have nothing in on-prem? Well, yeah, but we have those. Okay, so if you don't have an AD in on-prem, are you having everything in the cloud then? Sure. So how do we authenticate against the Wi-Fi? Well, that's a good question. We might need the AD still. We might set up something for that. So it's a reality on letting go of on-premises, but typically there's not a huge payback in there. It's easier to put everything in the cloud you can that makes sense and leave the stuff that runs quite nicely in on-prem as well. Here's a quick graphic on the core services that I often feel you should know. VMs, Azure SQL, web apps, and Azure AD. Once you know these, you can expand your thinking and your views a bit further. There's functions, there's MFA, all security-related stuff. Then you can expand it a bit further if you want to do Azure Data Factory. That's the ETL, extract, transform, and launch, because it takes so long. And finally, you can expand this to data lake, the bot framework, AI, machine learning, and maybe service fabric. And once you know all this, you can get to the UFO service, the really weird ones that there's no documentation available. If you want to have some fun, go to GitHub, find a tool called ARM Client, compile that, and you can do raw queries against Azure resources. Just don't use the delete commands because it doesn't ask you once. And once you know this, you can get to the cybersecurity reference architecture. I always show this when people tell me Microsoft doesn't know how to do security. I say, yeah, I agree. Let's have a look at this. Yeah, there's hardly any investments in security. There's a lot of services, a lot of licensing, a lot of deployment. It's not just a technical security approach. This is a publicly available slide at aka.ms/mcra. I highly recommend you download this and get the updates in the future. Another WTF moment. I bought an Xbox Live yearly subscription for the first time in my life. I don't have an Xbox, but I bought the subscription in hopes that I would get permission from my family to buy the Xbox as well. I didn't. So I started scratching this, and I was so happy to get the subscription that I accidentally scratched over the activation code. It actually got rid of the ink in one part of this. So I posted this on Twitter and said, somebody with AI skills, please use it and resolve this to me, and you can use it as you like. It's been 3 months. There hasn't been an AI that can figure out what the missing characters or numbers in the center are. So if you can resolve this, you're free to use the code as well. So everybody seems to have their own model for Azure implementations. This is from a customer of mine. They asked 3 different companies to implement a website. The first offer is we'll do custom authentication providers, custom everything. They actually implemented their custom firewall and reverse proxy because the ones that you have in Azure are not good enough. Fair enough, okay, impressive. And they run all integrations in VMs because nothing else scales. And everything is implemented in Java because that's the only real enterprise language. Alrighty. The next company wanted to do bleeding edge, everything containers, Kubernetes, also Service Fabric. Everything in C# or Java, depending on what they're actually building, and everything in containers, but they didn't really know how many microservices they were planning on building. I think it was up to 27 the last time I asked. And the last company that got chosen, one web app, one database, maybe service bus, a couple of Azure functions. That's about it. It took about 20 days to build that. So you can really see that people built this in different ways. Did I lose my clicker? No. Do you have to be a developer? A little. My favorite books are here, copying and pasting from Stack Overflow. It always helps. The last WTF is moving 70 virtual machines to the cloud in 2 months. The only challenge was that some of those were Windows Server 2003s, not supported in Azure. If you pay up, you might get some support for 2008, but not 2003. And the customer didn't have access to Azure subscription, so that was a slight hiccup in there when we started doing that. We finally decided we'll upgrade the VMs on the fly and convert some of that to PaaS, but they had a 10 meg uplink, which was already saturated. So when we started moving the VMs, it took about 2 weeks for one VM to replicate from on-prem to Azure. I said to them that I can actually fly to Dublin with a USB stick. It will be faster than using your link. We eventually got this up and running. It was painful, but we got rid of most of the VMs in here. So last but not least, we conducted a survey in Finland for IT pros and developers on how you study and how do you learn new stuff. On average, 30% of employees said they do not learn new skills while working unless somebody specifically asks and allocates the time and resources and gives them the training content. I was a bit saddened about this. But then I figured that's 30% less competition for me if somebody's not learning the new stuff. It allows me to sell better and do the cooler stuff, and I can let the VMs for the other people. One customer said they'll migrate everything to Office 365 and Azure, except mailboxes, because they do not trust Microsoft. Fair enough, so let's not migrate anything. Should you be a specialist or a generalist? It used to be you have to be a specialist. Nowadays, I advocate you should be a generalist with a couple of special skills that you can apply. And when things shift, there might not be a demand for something you know today. You have to quickly be able to ramp up on something else. docsmicrosoft.com is super good for that, because you can go to docsmicrosoft.com, click on a technology, and in the lower left corner you have download as PDF. Download that, you get 4,000 pages of content. The next time you're flying to the Canary Islands, you can just read that. The family can argue on something else, and you can get the good stuff from there. A couple of things I use to keep track of things. The Azure Advisors Yammer network is fairly good. If you don't have access there, get access there, because you get the latest and greatest stuff from there as well. My last survival guide here, understand Azure AD. That's really the key to a lot of things, not just the users and groups, but the authentication, the B2Cs, the B2Bs, the federation capabilities, and all of that happens in there. And you only really need to know about 5 to 10 services to be exceptionally good in Azure. The core things, they don't really change that often. The storage, it gets new features, but it's been mostly the same for 10 years. And you also need to make hybrid possible. You need to drive for the cloud, for the good things that you can run in the cloud, but you need to keep in mind that a lot of companies still need on-premises as well. Create proof of concepts. When you get new gadgets, when you have some time, build something. It teaches you a lot more than building something with your customers' money or with your own money for the company. And you need to unlearn stuff at times. There's a lot of stuff you don't simply need anymore. So you need to unlearn the visual basics. You need to unlearn the NT4s. You need to unlearn the command prompt commands so that you make new space available for the new stuff and you get the hunger to actually learn new stuff as well. Where to go from here? Get the book. It's a free PDF book from Microsoft on Azure strategy and implementation, and get the Azure architectures, free Visio and PDF content that you can lift and shift, modify, and use as your own. The Microsoft Professional Program, free of charge. They have a lot of good content for DevOps, AI, Azure administration, and development. And last but not least, the weekend is coming. This is my favorite recipe on doing salmon in the oven with a pesto wheel on top of that. It's super good. So make that, post a picture on Twitter, tag me. I'm happy to see what kind of results you're getting. Thank you for being here. Have a nice day.